You were sold the moment your father sat at my table, Naomi. This is simply the collection." The words were as cold as the rain drumming against the hangar roof, a rhythmic, violent sound that drowned out Naomi's ragged breathing. She stood in the center of the concrete floor, a splash of vibrant silk against a world of monochrome steel. Her beauty was a haunting, ethereal thing, honey bronze skin that seemed to glow in the dim light, and wide amber eyes that mirrored a soul currently being shattered. She didn't look like a girl who belonged in the blood-stained ledgers of the Goryeo Syndicate. She looked like a masterpiece being handed over to a man who only understood power. Hyun-woo stepped out of the shadows, the heels of his Italian leather shoes clicking with predatory precision. He was the Dragon of Soul, a man whose very name caused the city's elite to tremble. Yet here he was, looking at a terrified girl as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. He stopped inches from her, his presence a suffocating weight. The scent of rain and expensive tobacco clung to him, a sharp contrast to the soft, floral scent of her skin. Naomi's father, a man reduced to a trembling wreck, shoved a final set of papers toward Hyun-woo's secretary. He wouldn't look at his daughter. He couldn't. He had gambled away his fortune, his reputation, and finally his own blood. "Please," Naomi whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "I'll work. I'll pay it back. Just let me go home." Hyun-woo's hand rose, his fingers grazing the delicate line of her jaw. His touch was terrifyingly steady, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip with a slow, possessive intent. "You are home, Naomi," he murmured, his voice a low, melodic growl. "Your father didn't lose his money tonight. He lost his right to you. Every inch of this beauty, every breath you take, it belongs to me now." He didn't wait for her to weep. He didn't offer a hand of comfort. With a sharp nod to his guards, the circle closed around her. As she was led toward the waiting black limousine, Naomi looked back at the rainy runway, realizing that the girl she used to be had died the moment the dragon laid eyes on her. The transaction was complete, the debt was settled, and the nightmare was just beginning. The limousine moved through the neon-soaked streets of Seoul like a silent predator, the tinted glass separating Naomi from a world she no longer recognized. Beside her, Hyun-woo remained a statue of terrifying composure, his gaze fixed on the tablet in his lap, as if he hadn't just purchased a human life. Naomi pressed herself against the door, her heart a frantic drum behind her ribs. Every time the car hit a bump, she flinched, waiting for the monster to turn his hunger toward her. But he didn't even glance her way. When the vehicle finally hissed to a stop, it wasn't at a house, but a fortress. High gray walls topped with security cameras loomed over a sleek, brutalist mansion that felt more like a mausoleum of glass and marble than a home. The gates groaned open, swallowing them into the dragon's lair. "Out," Hyun-woo commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the quiet authority in his voice made Naomi's legs move before her mind could protest. Inside, the air was chilled to a surgical crispness. The foyer was vast, filled with shadows and the sharp scent of expensive wax. A line of servants stood in perfect, terrifying silence, bowing low as Hyun-woo stepped past them. He didn't acknowledge them. He simply caught Naomi's wrist, his grip firm enough to remind her of her chains, but light enough not to bruise. He led her up a sweeping staircase to a heavy mahogany door at the end of a long, dimly lit hall. "This is your world now," he said, swinging the door open. The room was breathtakingly opulent. Silk sheets the color of midnight, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-blurred city, and a wardrobe filled with clothes that cost more than her father's cafe. It was a gilded cage, beautiful and suffocating. Naomi stood in the center of the plush carpet, looking small and fragile in her wilted dress. "I can't stay here," she whispered, her voice cracking as she finally turned to face him. "Please, I'm not what you think I am." Hyunwoo stepped into her space, his shadow stretching long and dark across the floor. He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat before he settled for tucking a stray curl behind her ear. The heat radiating from his body was the only warmth in the room. "You are exactly what I think you are, Naomi," he murmured, his eyes darkening with a possessiveness that made her knees weak. "You are the only beautiful thing I have ever truly owned. Bathe, eat, sleep. Tomorrow your training begins." He backed away, the click of the door's lock echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Naomi was alone, trapped in a palace of ice, owned by a man who saw her only as his most exquisite prize. The dining room was a cathedral of shadow, lit only by the flickering glow of tall, black tapers that cast dancing silhouettes against the charcoal walls. At the head of a table long enough to seat 20, Hyunwoo sat alone, the silver in his hand glinting like a blade. When Naomi entered, guided by a silent maid, her footsteps were muffled by the heavy velvet rug. She had been forced into a dress of midnight silk that clung to her curves like a second skin, the dark fabric making her honey bronze complexion look almost luminous. "Sit," Hyunwoo said, not looking up from his glass of vintage Bordeaux. Naomi took the seat at the opposite end, the vast distance between them feeling like a canyon. The silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. A plate of exquisite, untouched food was placed before her, but the aroma only made her stomach twist with anxiety. "In my house, we do not waste," Hyunwoo remarked, his obsidian eyes finally lifting to meet hers. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, pinning her to the velvet chair. "And we do not sulk. You are here because a debt was owed. If you wish to be treated as more than a ledger entry, you will learn to play your part." "And what part is that?" Naomi's voice was small, but it didn't tremble. Hyunwoo stood, his tall, lean frame dominating the room as he walked the length of the table. He stopped behind her, his presence a sudden heat against her back. He leaned down, his hands gripping the back of her chair, his face so close she could feel the coolness of his breath against her neck. "You are to be the stillness in my chaos," he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous caress. "You will eat when I eat. You will stand when I enter a room. And you will never look at another man the way you are looking at me now, with fear. I want your respect, Naomi. Eventually, I will have your devotion." He reached forward, picking up a silver fork and offering a small piece of meat to her lips. It was a command disguised as a gesture of care. Naomi hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs, before she parted her lips and took it. His thumb brushed her lower lip as he pulled the fork away, a lingering touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. "Good," he murmured, his eyes darkening as he watched her swallow. "Compliance suits you far better than tears." He turned and left the room without another word, leaving Naomi alone in the flickering candlelight, realizing that the dragon didn't just want her body. He was methodically dismantling her soul. The peace of the estate was a lie, shattered the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. Hyunwoo had been called away to a meeting at the docks, leaving Naomi in the care of his most trusted guards. She was in the library, the scent of old paper the only comfort in her hollow existence, when the glass of the high windows exploded inward. Men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by black masks, swarmed the room like shadows birthed from the night. These weren't Hyunwoo's men. Their movements were jagged, their intent loud. "The dragon's new toy," one hissed, his hand snaking out to grab Naomi's hair. She let out a strangled cry, her small frame no match for the brute strength of the mercenary. They didn't want to kill her. They wanted a ransom, a bargaining chip to force the Goryeo syndicate into a corner. They were dragging her toward the broken window when the heavy oak doors of the library flew off their hinges. Hyun-woo stood there, his coat billowing like the wings of a dark god. He didn't look like the refined man who sat at the dinner table. He looked like a nightmare realized. Before the intruders could raise their weapons, Hyun-woo was a blur of lethal motion. The room became a cacophony of bone-snapping strikes and muffled grunts. Naomi scrambled into a corner, her eyes wide as she watched the man who owned her dismantle his enemies. There was a terrifying, cold elegance to his violence. He didn't hesitate. He didn't miss. When the last intruder lay gasping on the floor, Hyun-woo didn't check his own wounds. He walked toward Naomi, his knuckles split and bleeding, his eyes still burning with a predatory fire. Naomi shivered, shrinking back as he reached for her. She expected the cold command, the harsh reminder of her place. Instead, Hyun-woo dropped to one knee in front of her, his large, blood-stained hands hovering just inches from her face, trembling with a suppressed rage she didn't understand. "Did they touch you?" he rasped, his voice raw. I'm fine," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the blood on his shirt. He let out a breath that sounded like a growl, finally closing the distance to pull her against his chest. He held her with a desperate, crushing force, his face buried in the crook of her neck. For the first time, Naomi didn't just feel like a debt. She felt like something he was terrified to lose. The adrenaline of the attack faded into a bone-deep exhaustion that Naomi's body couldn't sustain. The harsh soul winter hammered against the mansion walls, and the stress of her captivity finally snapped the fragile threads of her health. By midnight, she was shivering beneath the midnight silk sheets, her skin burning with a fever that turned her honey bronze complexion into a flushed, agonizing mask of heat. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of ice, and in her delirium, the shadows of the room morphed into the masked men from the library. When the door creaked open, she expected a doctor, but it was Hyun-woo. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He dismissed the frantic house staff with a sharp flick of his wrist, shutting the world out. He didn't call for a nurse. He pulled a chair to the edge of the bed and sat, his obsidian eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that bordered on worship. "It hurts," Naomi whimpered, her eyes fluttering open but unable to focus. "Please, let me go home." "You are home," he murmured, but the bite was gone from his voice. He reached into a basin of ice water, wringing out a cloth with his scarred hands that had broken bones only hours before, and pressed it gently to her forehead. The cool shock made her gasp, and her hand instinctively flew up to catch his wrist. Hyun-woo froze. Any other person would have been executed for touching the Dragon of Soul so boldly, but he simply let her hold him. He watched her small, trembling fingers against his pulse, a muscle jumping in his jaw. Throughout the night, the man who ruled an empire of blood became a silent sentinel. He bathed her face with cold water, whispered low, rhythmic words in Korean that she couldn't understand but felt in her soul, and held her hand whenever she cried out in her sleep. As the sun began to bleed over the skyline, the fever finally broke. Naomi opened her eyes to find Hyun-woo still there, his eyes shadowed with a fatigue he would never admit to. He didn't pull away when he saw she was awake. Instead, he brushed a damp curl from her temple, his touch lingering with a softness that terrified her more than his rage ever could. In that moment, the predator had become the protector, and Naomi realized the gilded cage no longer had bars. It had him. The fever had passed, but it left behind a heavy, magnetic tension that filled the air of the master suite. Naomi stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the moonlight catching the amber in her eyes, while Hyun-woo watched her from the shadows. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a tether, pulling tighter with every heartbeat. When he rose and walked toward her, she didn't shrink away. The fear that had defined her existence since the hangar had been replaced by a dizzying, inevitable pull toward the man who had stayed awake all night to hold her hand. He stopped directly behind her, his heat radiating through her thin silk gown. His hands found her waist, his large palms spanning the delicate curve of her hips with a reverent steadiness. "I told myself you were just a debt," he rasped, his lips ghosting against the sensitive skin of her shoulder. "But I have never felt so poor as when I thought I might lose you to that fever." Naomi turned in his arms, her breath catching as she looked up at the dragon. His obsidian eyes were vulnerable, swirling with a hunger that was tempered by an agonizing restraint. When his mouth finally met hers, it wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a slow, tentative question. It was the taste of a man who had forgotten how to be soft. He carried her to the bed with a gentleness that made Naomi's chest ache, laying her down as if she were made of spun glass. Every movement was excruciatingly patient. He waited for her nod, for her whispered permission, before his hands traced the lines of her honey-bronze body. As they became one, there was no trace of the ruthless dawn. He moved with a slow, rhythmic grace, his gaze never leaving hers, murmuring soft words of praise that made her feel cherished rather than possessed. He prioritized her comfort above all else, guiding her through the initial sting of her innocence with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, the world outside ceased to exist. Hyunwoo didn't pull away or turn cold. He pulled the heavy velvet blankets around them, tucking her head into the crook of his neck. With a warm cloth and a basin of water, he personally tended to her, his touch light and meticulous as he cleaned her skin. He whispered against her temple until her breathing evened out, his arms a protective ring of steel that finally felt like sanctuary. The dragon hadn't just claimed his collateral, he had found his soul. The peace of the bedroom felt like a dream that the morning sun was determined to burn away. For a few hours, Naomi had forgotten the blood on Hyunwoo's hands, and he had forgotten the cold mathematics of his empire. But the Goryeo Syndicate did not allow for dreams. The intrusion came not with a crash, but with a low, persistent chime of a secure phone on the nightstand. Hyunwoo answered it, his face hardening back into the impenetrable mask of the dragon within seconds. "He's at the perimeter," his captain's voice crackled through the speaker. "He says he has the buyout. He's demanding to see his daughter." Naomi sat up, clutching the silk sheets to her chest, her heart leaping with a sudden, desperate hope. Her father. He had come for her. He had found a way to undo the nightmare. She looked at Hyunwoo, expecting to see relief, but his eyes were filled with a dark, simmering pity that made her blood run cold. They met in the sterile, gray light of the mansion's courtyard. Naomi's father stood there, looking older and more haggard than she remembered, clutching a heavy briefcase. When he saw Naomi, he took a step forward, but the click of a dozen safety catches being disengaged froze him in place. "I have the money, Hyunwoo," her father cried out, his voice cracking with a frantic, oily desperation. 100 million. Every cent of the debt, plus interest. Give me my daughter, and we'll disappear." Hyunwoo didn't move. He stood behind Naomi, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. "Where did you get the money, Elias?" "It doesn't matter. It's yours." "It matters," Hyunwoo said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Because my accountants flagged a discrepancy in the Goryeo offshore accounts last night. You didn't come here to save her with your fortune. You stole from me to buy back what you already threw away." The silence that followed was deafening. Naomi looked from the briefcase to her father's shifting, guilty eyes. He hadn't worked for this. He hadn't sacrificed. He had committed a suicide mission, using Hyunwoo's own stolen wealth to try and trick the most dangerous man in Seoul. It wasn't an act of love. It was one final, bungled gamble. You brought a death sentence to my doorstep and called it a gift, Hyunwoo murmured, his grip tightening on Naomi's shoulder, not to hurt her, but to keep her from falling. The air in the courtyard turned to ice as the realization of her father's betrayal settled over Naomi. The briefcase, once a symbol of her freedom, now sat on the pavement like a live grenade. According to the laws of the Goryeo Syndicate, theft from the dragon was a sin that could only be washed away in blood. The guards shifted, their shadows lengthening against the stone, waiting for the single nod from Hyunwoo that would end Elias's life. "Hyunwoo, please," Naomi breathed, her voice a fragile reed in the wind. She turned in the circle of his arm, her hands clutching the lapels of his dark coat. Her honey-bronze face was pale, her amber eyes swimming with a desperate, agonizing plea. She knew her father was a broken, foolish man, but he was the man who had held her hand before the world turned cold. "Don't do this. Not like this." Hyunwoo's face remained a mask of stone. His gaze flicked from the trembling man at the gates to the woman in his arms. The conflict in his eyes was a silent war. For a decade, he had ruled through unwavering, brutal consistency. To spare a thief was to show weakness, to invite a coup from the vultures circling his throne. Yet, as he looked down at Naomi, the only person who had ever seen the man beneath the monster, he felt the iron walls of his heart crumble. He stepped forward, leaving Naomi's side to stand over the briefcase. With a slow, deliberate movement, he kicked it toward the guards. "Take the money back to the treasury," he commanded, his voice echoing with a terrifying finality. He turned his gaze back to Elias, who had collapsed to his knees. "You are a ghost to me now," Hyunwoo stated, the words cutting deeper than any blade. "If you ever step foot in Korea again, if you even whisper her name, I will find you. You have no daughter. You have no debt. You have nothing." He turned his back on the man, ignoring the frantic sobs of relief and shame that followed. He walked back to Naomi and, without a word, swept her into his arms. He carried her away from the courtyard, away from the ghost of her past, and back into the sanctuary of the mansion. He had chosen. He had traded his reputation for her peace, proving that while he had bought her with a debt, he was now willing to pay any price to keep her smile.